two most dangerous giants in the Bible. Number 1. Og, King of Bashan. Behind that name is not just a man, but a legend of terror, power, and a battle that tested the faith of an entire nation. Og was an Amorite king who ruled in Bashan, from the city of Ashtaroth, in the rugged lands east of the Jordan River. In the days of Moses, as Israel slowly made its way back toward the Promised Land, their path did not lead through quiet valleys and open roads, but through kingdoms that saw them as a threat and refused to let them pass. Bashan was one of those kingdoms, and Og was not the kind of ruler anyone wanted as an enemy. Before Israel ever saw Og's army, they had already faced another Amorite king named Sihon.
Moses had sent a peaceful request, asking to pass through Sihon's territory, promising not to touch the fields, the vineyards, or the wells. Instead of agreeing, Sihon gathered his warriors, marched out in anger, and attacked. It was the first real test of this wandering nation against a seasoned enemy, and by human standards, Israel was inexperienced and exposed. Yet on that battlefield, God himself stepped in, and the people of Israel defeated Sihon and took his land. That victory became the backdrop for something even more intimidating: the clash with Og of Bashan. If Sihon was a threat, Og was a shadow that loomed even larger, known for his strength, his fortified cities, and his fearsome reputation. Humanly speaking, Israel had every reason to tremble. They were former slaves, desert travelers, not a long-established war machine. Yet this is exactly where the Bible wants us to slow down and notice something deeper. The story is not really about the size of the king or the experience of the army, but about what happens when an untrained people walk straight into the path of a giant and discover that the God who leads them is greater than every giant that stands in their way. When the Israelites continued their journey northward, they eventually reached the road that climbed into the region of Bashan. There, near a place known as Edrei, Og himself marched out with his entire army, not waiting for negotiations, not offering safe passage, but choosing war. According to Numbers 21:33-35, this was not a conflict that Israel sought, nor a battle that Moses planned. Israel was moving forward in obedience, and yet danger approached them from the shadows of a land ruled by a giant whose reputation struck fear into every neighboring kingdom. As Og advanced, bearing the weight of his armor and the stories of his immense stature, the people of Israel had every human reason to feel dread. They had seen giants before, and the memory of their ancestors' fear still lingered across the generations, especially among those who remembered the failed scouts in the book of Numbers, who once whispered about giants in the land and caused Israel to retreat in terror. Yet in this moment, something remarkably different happened. Moses heard the voice of the Lord saying, "Do not fear him, for I have handed over him and all his people and his land to you." It is a sentence that turns the entire story on its head, because God spoke in the past tense about a battle that had not yet been fought. Israel had barely drawn their swords, and the victory was already written. The outcome did not depend on Israel's experience or Og's terrifying strength, but on a divine decree. In fact, Israel's role was simply to walk into a battlefield that God himself had already claimed. When the fighting began, the text describes how Israel struck Og and all his people until no survivor remained, and they took possession of the land, just as the Lord had promised. Here, the biblical narrative gently reveals a deeper pattern that echoes throughout Scripture. The real struggle is rarely initiated by God's people, yet the result is never in doubt when God is the one who declares the final word. The battle with Og at Edrei becomes a living reminder that the giants who rise against us have already been measured, and that the courage God demands is not based on the size of our strength, but on the certainty of His promise, spoken long before the first sword is lifted.
The record found in Deuteronomy 3:3-7 expands our vision of Og's kingdom and reveals just how formidable his domain truly was. We learn that Og ruled over 60 fortified cities, strongholds built with massive walls, heavy gates, and iron bars designed to withstand the most determined enemy. These were not scattered villages, but fortified urban centers rising across the landscape of Bashan, each one a monument to military strength and ancient engineering. Yet the astonishing detail is that there was not one of the 60 cities that we did not take, meaning Israel, a people who had recently walked out of slavery and wandered through wilderness without any permanent fortress of their own, overpowered every city, one after another, through the word of the Lord. The text describes how the Israelites destroyed these cities completely, just as they had done with Sihon, removing every inhabitant and carrying away the livestock and the wealth. It is a picture that does not glorify violence, but instead draws attention to the dramatic reversal between human power and divine authority.
Og's walls were intimidating, but they could not hold. His gates were heavy, but they could not resist. His reputation was terrifying, and yet it collapsed as though it had been built on sand rather than stone. When we set this moment beside the earlier victory over Sihon, we begin to see a pattern. Israel conquers not because they are stronger, but because the Lord hands over kingdoms that seem immovable. And this pattern becomes a prophetic preview of a far more famous event that lies just ahead in Israel's story. When they finally reach the city of Jericho on the western side of the Jordan River, they will discover walls so thick and imposing that entire houses were built upon them. Yet even those colossal walls will crumble beneath the sound of trumpets and the command of God, proving once again that the strongest human defenses are fragile when they stand against the will of the Almighty. The fall of the 60 fortified cities of Bashan is more than a historical statement. It is a theological declaration. Nothing that is secured by human stone can resist the purposes of God. When He chooses to hand something over to His people, the outcome has already been written long before the walls begin to shake. Among the many details preserved in the biblical record, there is one that captures imagination more than anything else, almost like a surviving relic from a forgotten age of giants. Deuteronomy 3:11 tells us that Og possessed a bed of iron measuring 9 cubits by 4 cubits, which in modern terms stretches nearly 13.5 feet long and 6 feet wide. This massive frame was not mentioned casually. It served as evidence that Og belonged to a terrifying lineage known as the Rephaim, the remnants of ancient giants whose very presence had once caused Israel to tremble in fear. The text even notes that Og's iron bed remained in Rabbah of the Ammonites, as if kept deliberately, a monumental reminder of a ruler whose size was legendary and whose downfall testified to a power greater than bronze or iron. Yet the significance of Og's defeat reaches far beyond the battlefield of Bashan. News of Israel's astonishing victory spread rapidly throughout the land, traveling over mountains and through fortified cities until it reached even the walls of Jericho. There, a woman named Rahab confessed that her people had heard what the Lord had done to Sihon and Og and were terrified, believing that no fortress, not even Jericho itself, could stand before the God of Israel. The giants who once filled Israel with dread now caused the surrounding nations to tremble. For the same God who dried the waters of the Red Sea had overthrown kings whose strength was unmatched. The psalmists would later preserve these events in sacred songs, declaring in Psalm 135 and Psalm 136 that God struck down famous kings, including Sihon of Heshbon and Og of Bashan, not merely as historical notes, but as testimonies of His enduring mercy and victorious power. These ancient hymns echo like a liturgy of remembrance, reminding future generations that the greatness of God does not fade with time.
Thus, Og remains more than the shadow of an enormous ruler. He becomes a symbol of every giant that rises against God's people, only to fall by the hand of the Almighty. His name endures in Scripture not because he was invincible, but because his defeat stands as a monument to the God who triumphs over what seems untouchable. Scripture describes Og not only as a powerful Amorite king, but as one of the remnant of the Rephaim, a mysterious lineage associated with figures of enormous stature, fierce strength, and a terrifying presence on the battlefield. The Hebrew term Rephaim carries the meaning of giants and even terrible ones, suggesting a class of warriors whose appearance and reputation could strike fear into any nation. These giants were remembered not only for physical size, but also for the intimidation they inspired, standing as reminders of a primeval era when massive beings walked the land and contested the boundaries of human history. The Rephaim appear more than once in biblical memory, often linked to ancient stories about the Nephilim and the descendants of Anak, who were reported by the Israelite spies in Numbers 13. The scouts described themselves as grasshoppers in comparison, and declared that the land could not possibly be taken from such towering enemies. Their fear spread like wildfire, causing an entire generation to refuse God's promise and waste years wandering the wilderness, paralyzed by the threat of giants they believed were invincible. Yet the narrative shifts dramatically when the next generation rises. Unlike their fathers, the sons and daughters who trusted God under Moses and later Joshua confronted the same line of giants, Sihon, Og, and the Rephaim, and utterly defeated them. What once seemed impossible became certain, not because Israel suddenly grew stronger, but because they learned to believe that the God who led them out of Egypt had not changed. The lesson resounds through the centuries, echoing into the words of Jesus himself. With God, all things are possible. In other words, the giants that frightened Israel were never the real threat. Fear itself was the enemy. It is almost as though Scripture invites us to reconsider every fear that rises like a giant before us, and to remember that those giants fall easily when compared to the one who holds history in his hands. After the era of Moses and Joshua, Scripture turns our attention to another figure whose name has become nearly synonymous with impossible odds. Goliath was a Philistine giant, a warrior of extraordinary size and strength who rose during a period of intense conflict between Israel and the Philistine cities along the coastal plains. The Philistines had recently recovered from earlier defeats and now pressed into territory belonging to Judah, gathering their armies in preparation for a decisive clash. The setting for their confrontation was the Valley of Elah, a landscape shaped like a massive canyon stretching between two mountain ridges. On one slope stood the armies of Israel under King Saul, and on the opposite slope stood the Philistine forces, while the valley between them became the stage upon which one of Scripture's most famous confrontations would take place. Into this dramatic scene stepped Goliath, towering nearly 9 feet 9 inches tall, encased from head to foot in bronze armor that glimmered beneath the sun. His bronze helmet framed a face hardened by battle, while his body was wrapped in overlapping bronze scales like an impenetrable carapace. His legs were guarded by bronze greaves, and slung between his shoulders hung a heavy javelin, its iron head alone weighing nearly 20 to 25 pounds. Yet Goliath was not simply a massive man. He was accompanied by a shield bearer who walked ahead of him with a shield large enough to cover a grown warrior, creating a moving wall of defense that made him look less like a human and more like a living engine of war. From this fortified posture, he issued a chilling challenge, demanding a representative combat, one man from Israel against himself, declaring that whichever champion prevailed would determine the fate of both armies. Morning after morning and evening after evening, for 40 relentless days, Goliath stepped forward into the valley, shouting threats, hurling insults and defying the armies of the living God. His size alone was enough to paralyze most men, but the true power of his presence lay in psychological warfare. He sought to crush Israel not only through brute strength, but through fear itself, towering over the valley like a reminder of every threat that seems too large to overcome. Into this tense and fearful atmosphere, Scripture introduces a figure who does not resemble a warrior at all. David was the youngest son of Jesse from the small town of Bethlehem, a shepherd boy whose daily life consisted of guiding sheep across the Judean hills and protecting them from beasts of the field. He was far too young to be enlisted in Saul's army, and while his older brothers marched to war, David remained at home, unknown, unnoticed, and seemingly irrelevant to the unfolding drama in the valley of Elah. One day, Jesse called the young David and instructed him to carry food, bread, roasted grain, and cheese to his brothers on the battlefield and to bring back news of their well-being. David rose early, as shepherds do, and set out with no thought of danger and certainly no intention of fighting. To him, it was simply an errand born of obedience to his father and care for his family. Yet the moment he reached the outskirts of the camp, he heard the sound of men preparing for battle and soon found himself standing on the battle line, just as Goliath stepped forward for the 41st morning in a row. While the armies of Israel fled once again at the sound of the giant's challenge, David responded with a question that cut through the fear like a blade. "What will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" In a single sentence, David revealed not only his indignation at Goliath's blasphemy, but his unwavering conviction that the honor of God mattered more than the size of any enemy. When King Saul heard of David's interest, he declared a remarkable reward: wealth, marriage to the king's daughter, and freedom from taxation for David's family. Yet even such incentives could not produce a volunteer from the seasoned warriors who trembled in the shadow of Goliath. The irony is striking. Israel had a king who stood head and shoulders above his people, yet it was a shepherd boy carrying bread who would dare to step forward. David entered the valley as a messenger, but something ignited within him, a holy jealousy for the name of God that transformed him from a mere delivery boy into a challenger of giants. Before the fateful encounter began, Saul attempted to prepare David by clothing him in the king's own armor. Yet the weight, the metal, and the unfamiliar shape restricted David's movement, reminding him that he was not called to win this battle by imitating another warrior. He removed the armor, returned it to Saul, and chose instead the simple sling and shepherd's staff he had carried through pastures and rocky hillsides. What seemed inadequate to men would become the instrument of divine victory, because this confrontation was not ultimately between two soldiers, but between human might and the living God. As David approached the valley floor, Goliath stared in disbelief, mocked him, and cursed him in the names of the gods he trusted. He threatened to feed the young shepherd's flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field, treating him like an insignificant intruder daring to insult a champion of war. In that moment, David answered with words that still resound through the ages. "You come to me with a sword, and with a spear, and with a javelin. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts." And again, "This day the Lord will hand you over to me." It was a declaration that victory belongs not to the strongest armor, but to the God who commands the battle. David then ran toward the giant, reaching into his bag for a single stone, and in one motion released it from his sling. The stone cut through the air and struck Goliath square in the forehead, the one exposed place beneath his bronze helmet. The colossal warrior collapsed face first to the ground, his strength undone by a weapon that should never have overcome him. David had no sword of his own,
but he used Goliath's blade to finish the battle, severing the giant's head as the Philistine army turned and fled in panic. Their unbeatable champion lay motionless, and the weapons that once embodied their pride became trophies of a victory accomplished by faith. In this moment, the narrative reveals something extraordinary. God chose a young shepherd and a simple stone to dismantle the most fearsome war machine of his day. The giant who terrified nations fell before a boy who believed the battle belonged not to warriors, but to the Lord of hosts. When we step back and look at the stories of Og and Goliath together, it becomes clear that Scripture is not merely recounting ancient battles, but offering living lessons for every generation that reads these accounts with eyes of faith. First, we learn that facing giants is undeniably intimidating. If we were standing beside Moses looking at Og, the towering ruler of Bashan, or if we were among Saul's soldiers staring up at Goliath in the valley of Elah, our hearts would likely tremble. From a purely human perspective, these encounters seem impossible, because giants embody everything that overwhelms our strength and magnifies our fears. Second, we discover that we ourselves must enter the fight that confronts us. Just as Israel could not avoid Og, and just as David could not allow another to step in his place, each person must face the specific giants that rise in their own life. No pastor, mentor, parent, or friend can fully fight the giant that stands before someone else. Your Og is yours, and your Goliath is yours. Scripture gently reminds us that avoidance does not lead to victory, but courage rooted in God's presence does. Third, these stories reveal that trusting God provides a deep and remarkable stability. Moses and David were not heroic because of their abilities, but because they learned to anchor themselves in God's promises. When we spend time in prayer, and when our hearts learn to rest beneath the shelter of God's faithfulness, the ground beneath us becomes firm, even when giants seem to shake the earth. It is not self-confidence that defeats giants, but confidence in the one who goes before us. Finally, acquiring victories leaves a mark that shapes our memory and our testimony. When David recalled the lion and the bear he had defeated as a shepherd, he strengthened not only his own resolve, but the faith of those who heard him. Likewise, every time God brings us through an overwhelming challenge, that victory becomes part of our story, a witness to others, and a reminder for future battles that God is still who He has always been. In this way, the fall of Og and the fall of Goliath echo across time, inviting us to remember that the giants we fear are never larger than the God who overcomes them.